going to talk about dialogue. Dialogue is where characters speak, right? But they speak in written form because you're writing out what they say. So you got to think about it in a particular way. Now, before we get into that, you got to think about where dialogue sits in the narrative types. When you're writing a story, you can either describe action, so what actually happens physically in the scene. You can use dialogue where characters speak. You can use inner voice where you're essentially in a character's head and you're describing what they're thinking, what they're feeling from within themselves. And you can have backstory or exposition, where you explain what came before, what is this particular place that we're in, or what is the background to the action taking place. Now, backstory slows things down quite a bit. So you got to try to weave it into the rest of the scene so that it's lighter and it's more direct, because we interpret it rather than receive it. And that's always better because we make it our own. So for example, instead of describing a character and everything they did up to that moment, you can reference what came before in an inner voice where they look at, say, a trinket and it reminds them of something, but you always describe it from their point of view, okay? So you don't delve into it too much. Or you put it in dialogue. But again, we'll look at dialogue more in a second, but it can't just be, oh, you remember that the last 10 years we've been doing this and that, because no one talks that way, right? So we're gonna look at ways to do that a little more subtly. But that's where the dialogue sits, right? Action, dialogue, inner conflict, backstory. You want dialogue to drive the story forward. So dialogue is the voice of characters. It may seem very obvious, but that's essentially what it is. And so it reveals a lot about a character. One way it reveals a lot is through the musicality of dialogue, okay? If dialogue is spoken all the way the same way and is read in a narrative linear fashion, it's fairly boring, to be honest. You need to play with the melody of a dialogue, which means you need to vary things in your dialogue so that there's a particular rhythm there. A pause is an important element of dialogue, and you can insert that in the way you write by isolating a piece of dialogue, breaking it up, and then going to the next. That creates a natural pause. Silences can say a lot. You switch from dialogue to inner voice, and then back to dialogue again. All sorts of things are happening there. That's very interesting. But think of it as music, right? You're writing the sheet music to the music that the dialogue is. So try to do that in a way where you use rhythm, you use cadence, or cadence, depending on how you pronounce it. You use the size of sentences and the sonority of words to create this kind of musicality that really makes a character's voice stand out. Now, we're going to look more about a character's voice later on, but in terms of dialogue, that's how I need you to think about the musicality of it. The dialogue that is a character's voice defines that character's tone, their mood, right? How they feel about what they are saying. So you say something through gritted teeth, and you've got these sharp, kind of swift actions that snap. You can tell someone's a little bit angry, a little bit frustrated about it. If you have these long and winding sentences that go on and on without really a beginning or an end because everything is fine, then the character's more relaxed. You can feel that in the voice. You can write it out that way. And that's going to create that mood, okay? The key thing to use to reveal stuff about a character in dialogue is subtext. So we talked before about negative space and positive space in another module about scenes. So positive space being what you say, negative space, what goes on in the head. The subtext is kind of the same thing. There's what people say and what people mean. And I'm sure in everyday life you've noticed this, right? A lot of people, in fact, most people don't actually say what they mean. They say something else. And you have to decipher what it is they mean. That is subtext. There's what's being said, and beneath the surface, is what is being meant. So think of it as an iceberg, right? You've got the tip of the iceberg, that's what's being said, and underneath that, underwater, the big chunk of it, the reality of it, the truth lies. The subtext is what they really mean. So what is subtext? Well, you can have, say, I don't know, two vampires talking about the kind of steak they like to eat. You know, one likes the steak to be cooked rare and the meal to be prepared in advance and so on. And the other one likes to just slap it in the pan and eat it right there and then. The subtext here is that they're not really talking about food, they're talking about killing. Right? It reveals a little bit about what they think about when they consider a victim as a vampire. Now, subtext can be actually more present, more at the forefront. Like it can be less subtle than this. A subtext can be when two people are talking about someone else's marriage, but in fact, they're really talking about their own marriage. And so that subtext reveals a lot about what they think, because they seem to be judging someone else, but in fact, they reveal how they're judging each other. And they do it subtly through the negative space. The reader interprets as they go along. Those are the kind of dialogue scenes that you want to aim for. So a little word about how to write dialogue in terms of technical punctuation and things like that. You've got what are called tags. Tags are indications of who is speaking. So things like, I don't want you to touch this, said Tony. That's a tag, right? But within that tag, you can insert a little bit of emotion. You can insert some action, right? So, I don't want you to touch this, said Tony with a smile. All right, well, what does that tell you? That tells you that Tony isn't really too bothered about whoever is touching that thing. It can be something more of a game. But if you say, I don't want you to touch that, said Tone, his jaw clenched. Ooh, all of a sudden, Tony may not be that happy about what's happening here and may really want this to stop, okay? The action you put in the tag puts a spin on the dialogue, because you'll notice that in both of these examples, the dialogue is the same, but the reaction is different, okay? Another thing technically that you can use is you can break up dialogue over different lines to insert actions or reactions. Now, there are particular rules that editors use and that seem to say, okay, you need to keep the dialogue of one character in a paragraph and only open another paragraph if you want another character to speak. That helps to clarify things, which is always better, but it's not a hard and fast rule. However, I would encourage you to first master that rule before you start to break it. And that goes for any of the rules that we're talking about, right? Master them first, decide which ones to break later, okay? But in terms of tags, put them in there and put the tone in there, but don't go over the top, right? Just a little bit here and there, just to give us a flavor of what's going on, but use action more than descriptive to show what tone the character is speaking in, okay? The best thing to do is to actually give the character something to do while they're talking. So it can be washing the dishes, and all of a sudden they're going to start to do it differently when their tone changes. All right, they're going to stop a few things in the sink, or they might break something as they're wiping it down, or something like that. And that tells you, okay, tension is coming, or things are pretty relaxed, or in fact they just stop and they just keep the water running, and they realize after a while they haven't really progressed. It's because they're starting to go deep into their mind and they're stopping the action. All these elements give you ways to enhance the mood of the dialogue, the emotion of the dialogue. So that dialogue doesn't just stand on its own, but is woven within the story that you're trying to tell, okay? Again, practice, practice, practice. Very often when we think of dialogue, we think that we need to write conversations like they happen in real life. Not exactly true. Yes, there are elements of real life that you should, by all means, I think, involve in your dialogue. So, ways in which we speak to each other. We interrupt each other. We start a sentence, but we don't finish it. We drop some words. We're not entirely perfect in our eloquence. That's good to put in dialogue because that makes it real. It's something that we can relate to. However, we also need to know that in a story, dialogue needs to be distilled, right? We have to jump over the mundane stuff that is in normal conversations and go straight to the golden nuggets of conversations that push the story forward, okay? So when you do that, you're still making your characters talk in a relatable way, but you're doing it faster, tighter than in reality, okay? So you very quickly skip from one subject to another, right? And very often what happens in dialogue scenes is that you have, think of it as a tree, right? You've got one character developing a certain branch, and then a character pulls it in another branch direction. And then the other character pulls it back somewhere else. And that happens in real life, but it takes a lot longer. So in a story, you can jump from one to the other super quick, and that drives things forward. You then be the judge of how quick you do that. Sometimes it's too quick, but you'll get a feel for it as you practice, and especially as you listen to your characters. All right? Your characters' voices need to be in that dialogue, and they're going to inform those branching out elements that are going to punctuate your scene. When we talk about how a person speaks, we have to understand the different things that influence the way we speak. So it's not just the circumstances. We're not going to speak in the same way at a funeral as we are at a bachelor party, for example, or we're not going to speak in the same way in front of a classroom as we are speaking to a best friend in isolation. So that's going to affect how we speak. More intrinsically, what happens is that we are not going to speak the same way depending on our age. Right? So kids and older people will speak in different ways because of experience, because of their feelings and how they want to speak, how they want to express themselves. Gender or gender identity is also going to influence how you speak. Psychologically, it's been proven that men, or rather observed, that men tend to use fewer words than women in general ways. The reason behind that is that men tend to internalize their thought a lot more and only speak the parts that they are comfortable with, whereas women tend to share their thought process a lot more and therefore use more words in the process of that sharing approach. It doesn't mean that one has less to say than the other or that one should be ignored more than the other. Absolutely not. What it means is that people talk differently, and you can take that into account. A social background of a person or a character is also going to influence how they speak. The environment they grew up in, the environment they work in. You notice that when someone is working a lot on the phones, in their social environment, when they make a call, it's super fast because they're used to doing that at work, right? Or if someone is in the military, they usually talk in crisp, sharp sentences because that's how they're used to communicate with orders being given and received. So things like that will influence you. Your education. If a character that you write is not very educated, then their grammar, their speech is not going to be very developed because it will have been learned empirically by talking to other people who presumably will be of the same level of education as them. So you got to take that into account. At the same time, if you're writing a story about a prince who's had lots of private tutors and the best kind of schools and things like that, that person is going to speak far more eloquently and fluidly than someone who doesn't have that education. Where people come from is also going to influence how they speak, and that's not just about accents, but also about the culture there of the types of words that you use and the grammatical structure that you use. Eskimos, for example, have literally hundreds of words to describe snow because that's their environment. So they're going to be far more specific when it comes to certain things that relate to their environment. So if you have an Eskimo who's traveling to the desert and meeting a Bedouin who will have maybe dozens of words for describing sand, they may be able to bond about their environment and talk about things in a certain way, but they are going to have trouble communicating about the immediate environment because they're not going to have the same vocabulary. So things like that are things that can influence how a character can talk or what they say. Now, it's good also in dialogue to give people some identifiable dialogue structures. So things that they will often say, or catchphrases, or little ambiguities they have in dialogue, a certain speech pattern they may have, because that helps people identify who's speaking and form a little bit of empathy, a little bit of reaction to that dialogue that creates a bond with the character as we read what they're speaking. So try to weave that in, but don't make it a gimmick, because as soon as it's a gimmick, it becomes irritating. So peppering this here and there makes for good use. Finally, I'm going to leave you with this. Dialogue needs purpose. It needs to be unique. It needs some motivation behind it so that when we read them, we understand that there could have been no other way for the character to say anything else than that piece of dialogue. Right? It's hard to do that, and it won't come naturally immediately, but the more you practice, the more you listen to dialogue, the way people speak, the more you'll be able to grab here and there little things that you can put in the dialogues of your characters and make them truly come alive. Remember, it's about distilling the dialogue to its absolute core to drive the story. Think of those branches, characters speaking, who pull the dialogue in different directions. Do it fast, do it tightly, and you'll have great dialogue scenes enhanced with the action that you give your characters to do as they're speaking.